Part 2, chapters 1 through 3 of The Origins of Christianity by Thomas Whittaker. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Van Manen on the Pauline literature. Part 2, The Epistle to the Romans. Introduction. For ages, the 14 epistles attributed to St. Paul in the New Testament were all undoubtedly accepted as proceeding from the apostle of the Gentiles. The leaders of the Reformation in the 16th century, however, were so far critical as to contest the epistle to the Hebrews, and the doubt as to its genuineness has never since been suppressed. From the latter part of the 18th century, more and more inroads have been made on the epistles still accepted as genuine. By the Tübingen school, these were reduced to 4, namely Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, and Galatians. In these also, interpolations were admitted by their defenders, and by degrees it came to be seen that, under the application of the tests which had been fatal to the rest, even the epistles universally received could not hold together as a whole. So the process of demolition went on, until, before the end of the 19th century, the time could be seen fast approaching when, of the once imposing edifice, not one stone should be left on another. In justifying the conclusion arrived at, the appeal is to those who are willing to examine the epistles without traditional assumptions, whether those of the Church or of the science of our days. Taking first the Epistle to the Romans, we place ourselves before it in complete freedom and ask, what is it and whence? Our aim is simply to know the truth as regards Christian antiquity. 1. The nature of the work. We speak of the Epistle to the Romans, but is the composition properly an epistle? Undoubtedly it presents itself under the external form of a letter. This, however, is mere appearance, as even the opening verses make plain. The disquisition contained in chapter 1 verses 2 through 6 betrays the author of a dogmatic treatise who wishes to dispose as summarily as possible of a number of disputed points the discussion of which is current in certain circles. Even apart from this, the address is far from clear. Comparison of the text, chapter 1 verse 7, with other passages, for instance, chapter 12 verse 3, and with a usage known to ecclesiastical writers, shows that the words tois ousin mean those that really are, that is, do not merely seem to be Christians. What is indicated is a spiritual circle of hearers, not a local community. And indeed, there are specific reasons for holding the mention of Rome in this place, as also in chapter 1 verse 15, to be interpolated. Generalized rhetorical forms, again, such as occur in many places, for instance, chapter 2 verses 1, 3, 17, chapter 9 verse 20, chapter 11 verse 13, chapter 12 verse 3, chapter 14 verses 4, 10, and 15, point to the great public and not to a limited circle of determinate persons, as the audience addressed. However patient we may be in the matter of salutations, it is difficult to find truth and not fiction in the words, all the churches of Christ salute you. Chapter 16, verse 16. The contents generally are those of a book rather than of a letter. Neither the doctrinal nor the hortatory discourses which succeed one another seem more adapted to the needs of the Christians at Rome than anywhere else. Viewing the work as an epistle, we try in vain to form any idea of the relation between the writer and his readers. No light is thrown on this relation either by the Acts of the Apostles or by tradition. According to tradition, Peter and Paul were the founders of the community at Rome, whereas it follows quite clearly from the epistle that the Christians addressed were such before the writer had ever seen them face to face. We get no more light from the details, which indeed frequently give contradictory impressions. The faith of the Roman Christians is spoken of throughout the whole world (chapter 1, verse 8), so that the apostle can put it on a level with his own (chapter 1, verse 12), and yet he speaks of himself as striving to preach the gospel not where Christ was named, lest he should build upon another man's foundation. Chapter 15, verse 20. No explanation has succeeded in making it comprehensible why Paul should address such a letter to Christians personally unknown to him at Rome. In no traditional record do we come upon a trace of any impression, favorable or unfavorable, made by it among those to whom it is supposed to have been addressed. And yet it was not the kind of letter to be simply received, read, and laid aside. So various are the contents that grounds can be assigned with equal show of reason for holding that the community at Rome consisted of Jewish Christians, of heathen Christians, and of a mixture of both. Sometimes, indeed, the work seems to be meant even for Jews and heathens who are outside Christianity. The result of the whole examination is that, whoever wrote it, we have before us not an epistle in the proper sense of the term, but a book, a treatise in epistolary form. 2. The unity of the book. Whatever conclusions may be arrived at as to the way in which it was composed, the relative unity of the book in its traditional form must be recognized. That there should be slight additions or interpolations is a matter of course in a book coming down from antiquity that has been much read and has passed through the hands of many copyists. The cases of this kind that occur and are recognized by textual critics do not in the least affect the general view we must take. None of the pieces that make up the composition can be removed without injury to the whole. If we suppose it to end, as has often been fancied, at chapter 14, verse 23, we feel that there is no proper close. In content, as well as in form, it is a whole as it stands. With a little goodwill, we may find in it what might appear to the writer a coherent development of the Pauline doctrine, and an ordered reply to the objections urged against it. The minor disquisitions fit into the scheme as a whole. A conclusion such as we have was an essential part of it. The traditional text is, accordingly, no product of an accidental conjoining of scattered pieces. There is identity of style, as may be seen by comparison with the Epistle of James, or of Clemens Romanus, or with one of the Johannine epistles. Thus, most even of the critics who propose to divide it have been obliged to recognize the Pauline origin of the separated parts, and not merely of that which they regard as the original epistle addressed to the Romans. This insistence on the unity of the work had to be placed in the foreground to guard against misunderstanding of what follows. 3. Its composition. For the unity insisted on is, it must be repeated, a relative unity. It reminds one of the unity of a synoptic gospel, or of the Acts of the Apostles. The writer has not freely or logically developed his own thought, but has roughly sketched out a plan with a view to the incorporation of older writings which he had before him. Into this plan he has fitted his materials, modifying and adapting them, but not effacing the signs of their previous separate existence. Hence, the discrepant judgments that have been passed by critics according as they have been struck by the identity of the hand that put together the whole work, or by the difference of character in the parts. There are sutures that make its dependence on written sources visible to the attentive reader. A. Traces of juncture and manipulation. To discover these, let us examine the parts of the epistle successively as they present themselves according to a natural division. The address, chapter 1, verses 1-7. Verses 2-6 break the continuity between verses 1 and 7. Their doctrinal intention is plain. 1. Stress had to be laid on the prefiguring of Paul's gospel in the prophetic parts of the Old Testament. Verse 2. The fact that the Catholics who affirmed the connection with the Old Testament and the Marcionites who dwelt on the break with it alike appealed to the authority of Paul shows the probable absence in the older Paulinism of any definite pronouncement on the point. 2. The affirmation that the Son of God is a descendant of David according to the flesh, verse 3, proceeds from the effort to reconcile the old Pauline with the Messianic idea. Characteristic passages in the epistle show absence of all preoccupation with the manner in which the Son of God was made flesh. A very close analysis of expressions, such as that of chapter 8, verse 3, would lead to the notion that the body of Christ was merely apparent. From a point of view like this, descent from David could be of no importance. 3. The intention of verse 4, in spite of some unintelligible words in the text as it stands, evidently is to assert that Jesus became the Son of God by rising from the dead. This conception, that he became or was made the Son of God, was not unknown to the old Christian world. See, for instance, Acts chapter 2, verse 36, chapter 26, verse 23. But finds no place in the thought of the writer, for whom the Son of God was a pre-existent being. Romans chapter 8, verses 3 and 32. Sent to manifest himself on earth before he died and in his death. Chapter 5, verses 6, 8, and 10. 4. The same verse, in affirming the identity of the Pauline Son of God with Jesus Christ our Lord, illustrates the process of fusion by which the favorite expressions of the Paulinists and of the old disciples of Jesus were combined. The variation again between Christ Jesus and Jesus Christ, compare verses 1 and 4, is not arbitrary. The first belongs distinctively to Paulinism, for which Christ, as a supernatural being, is prior. The second is a formula of reconciliation, enabling the older disciples to adopt the new ideas. Comparison of variants in the texts, where the two types of expression occur, shows that the predominant tendency was to change from the former to the latter. 5. The intention of verse 5 is to combat the mistaken imagination that Paul attained his apostleship in an illegitimate way, that is, not as called by Jesus. The plural, however, contrasting as it does with the singular, which is retained in verses 1 and 8-16, shows that the writer was thinking not of Paul alone, but of Paul and those of his direction, and betrays the hand of the redactor. 6. The particular intention of verse 6 is to convey the idea that the original readers of the epistle were heathen Christians brought to the gospel by Paul. The redactor is aiming at a wider public, consisting of all kinds of believers, not simply of the few who have reached a spiritual height, to whom, as verse 7 shows, the original form of the epistle was addressed. Introduction, chapter 1, verses 8 through 17. Here we find a complication of inconsistent reasons for desiring to come and see those who are addressed at Rome. This again points to the hand of the redactor, as does also the glaring want of sequence towards the conclusion of the passage. The whole, however, is not to be held for the work of the redactor himself, but rather for an attempt to combine pre-existent ideas current in different surroundings. 1. Paul desired to visit the Romans in order to give them some spiritual gift and for mutual confirmation in the faith, verses 9 through 12. 2. He was constantly making plans that he might have fruit of his missionary activity among the brethren at Rome as elsewhere, verse 13. 3. Though he had no reasons connected with the particular community at Rome, still he wished to come because he felt himself a debtor to all men. Verse 14. First part, chapter 1, verse 18 through chapter 8, verse 39. When we enter upon the attempted demonstration of the power of the gospel for the salvation of all believers, whether Jews or Greeks, we find too many incompatible positions to leave open the possibility that the whole proceeded from the same author, developing his own thought without reference to sources. In detail, the characteristic procedure is the mechanical linking of sentences by means of particles that should denote logical transition. This is intelligible on the supposition that the whole is composite, but not otherwise. Among the more prominent antitheses, the following may be noted. The God who will render to every man according to his works, chapter 2, verse 6, is not precisely the God of the Paulinism taught elsewhere in the section. The writer who says that the doers of the law shall be justified, chapter 2, verse 13, is other than the writer who says that by the works of the law there shall no flesh be justified, chapter 3, verse 20. Again, the verses chapter 3, verses 25 through 26 express a different idea from that which is indicated in chapter 3, verse 24, and other passages taken in conjunction with chapter 8, verse 20. In the former, the Son of God is offered as a propitiation by God to himself to satisfy the demands of his own justice. In the latter, he is the price of man's redemption paid to a power standing over against God. Note the words dia ton hupaxanta in chapter 8, verse 20, and compare with Galatians chapter 3, verse 13, chapter 4, verse 5, 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 8, chapter 5, verse 5, chapter 8, verse 5, chapter 10, verses 20 through 21. The first named passage proceeds from a more Jewish-minded Paulinist. In the second, we detect a Gnostic thought. According to the passages of the latter type, the justification on God's part is gratuitous, chapter 3, verse 24. Further, in the comparison between Adam and Christ, chapter 5, verses 12 through 19, the coming of death into the world is ascribed alternately to the sin of one man, verse 12a, 13, and 14, and to the sin of all, verse 12b. Another antithesis becomes visible in the idea of a permanent moral struggle as distinguished from a redemption once for all completely effected. The impressive passage, chapter 7, verses 7 through 25, cannot be reconciled with the passages where the Christian is described as having broken forever with sin in becoming free from the law. To make the ejaculation of chapter 7, verse 24, with its note of moral seriousness, refer only to Paul's pre-Christian life, is to reduce it to mere verbiage. The aspiration here is for freedom from the body, and it refers to the inward conflict still to be undergone by those who from full conviction have already embraced Christianity. Whatever may be the original source of this passage, the redaction proceeds from one whose aim it was to rescue the Pauline teaching from the reproach of antinomianism. Second part, chapters 9 through 11. It takes good will to find any connection between the second part and the first. Logical sequence there is none. We hear nothing more of justification by faith. Even the words dikaios, dikaion, dikaiosthai are not to be found. The question is a new one. Why do the heathen accept the gospel, while Israelites exclude themselves from its benefits? The opinion of the critics who regard this piece as originally by another hand is substantially correct, though, as was said before, a relative unity has been imposed on the different parts in the redaction. It forms a whole by itself, and has a conclusion of its own, as indeed the first part, with which it is externally linked, has an excellent one. In its successive chapters, an intimate relation of the writer to Israel is supposed, which the preceding ones in no way suggest. He is eager to declare himself an Israelite of the seed of Abraham, of the tribe of Benjamin. Chapter 11, verse 1. In the former part, an entirely different tone is taken with the Jew. Chapter 2, verse 17, whom the author addresses as if he had nothing in common with him. Differences of vocabulary, besides the one mentioned above, can be pointed out, notwithstanding the general uniformity of style. In chapters 1 through 8, the words Israelite and Israel do not occur. In chapters 9 through 11, the first occurs twice and the second 11 times. On the other hand, the word Jew occurs 9 times in chapters 1 through 3, and only twice in chapters 9 through 11. In both of which cases, besides, it may with probability be referred to the redactor. In chapters 1 through 8, Christ is called 7 times. In chapters 9 through 11, never, the Son of God. Here, the condition of salvation is to confess with the mouth that Jesus is the Lord, and to believe in the heart that God raised him from the dead. Chapter 10, verse 9. The peculiar relation of faith to grace and the Spirit does not come into view. The general drift of the 3 chapters is the defense of Paul from the charge that he had no care for the ancient people of God. Like the preceding ones, they form in themselves not a single, but a composite whole, being put together from sources. This may be shown by inconsequences in the order, inconsistencies in detail, and peculiar repetitions, but especially by the presence of broadly contrasted views as to the rejection or return of Israel. The first view is that the rejection of God's people needs no explanation beyond his good pleasure. Chapter 9, verses 14 through 29. Next, we learn that in fact God has not rejected his people, for a remnant has believed. Chapter 11, verses 1 through 8. Then, at the close, not to attempt to follow all the complex involutions, the mystery is revealed that, when the fullness of the Gentiles is come in, all Israel shall be saved, so that finally all are saved. Chapter 11, verses 25 through 32. Such divergent views were certainly not born in the same brain. Third part, chapter 12 through chapter 15, verse 13. The attachment of the third to the preceding parts is loose and merely mechanical. It would not be correct to say that Paul has put first the statement of his doctrine, and then added a hortatory completion. There are hortatory passages in the foregoing chapters, as there are doctrinal statements in those of the third part. This last, while forming, in the sense already defined, an essential portion of the whole, has a different origin from the others. In many peculiarities of vocabulary and contents, it agrees with portions of the Epistles to the Corinthians more than with Romans chapters 1 through 11. The idea, for instance, of a measure of faith imparted to each, chapter 12 verse 3, is foreign to the earlier chapters of Romans, both in expression and in thought, while it agrees in both with passages in Corinthians. For Romans chapters 1 through 11, faith is the one first principle of the new life, and carries with it everything else. The idea of a distinction among the gifts of grace, chapter 12 verses 6 through 8, has its parallel not here, but in 1 Corinthians chapter 12 verses 4 through 11 and verses 28 through 30. This section of the epistle is in itself less organic than the other two. Construction of the passages, for instance chapter 13 verses 1 through 7, out of various fragments, is disclosed by alternations, otherwise inexplicable, between the second and third persons singular and plural, and by the use of different terms for the same office. The dissertation on the strong and the weak believer, chapter 14 through chapter 15 verse 13, presents itself as an independent but not unmodified piece. The weak in the faith appear from chapter 14 verse 2 to be vegetarians, but are afterwards treated as Jewish-minded Christians, for instance 1 Corinthians chapters 8 through 10, who esteem one day holier than another, chapter 14 verse 5, and regard some meats as unclean, verses 14 and following. Perhaps, as has been conjectured, the original ending of the piece is concealed in chapter 15 verse 5, which a redactor extended by the next verse, adding his own terminal formula to the simpler one of the primary document. Conclusion, chapter 15 verse 14 through chapter 16 verse 27. The conclusion has so little of an organic character, either in relation to the whole or in itself, that many critics who hold to the Pauline origin of the rest of the epistle have declared it not genuine, or have tried to account for its presence here by supposing it brought in from another epistle of Paul. For us, the question is not whether it is genuine, but whether it was originally the conclusion of the epistle entitled To the Romans. This question has already been answered in the affirmative, though the answer does not exclude further queries as to possible modification and rearrangement. The last chapter has a peculiarly inorganic character. Some have supposed verses 1 through 20 to be part of a letter Paul wrote to the Ephesians, which is, so far, to admit the theory of composition out of fragments. B. Witnesses for the existence of a shorter epistle. The result of the preceding investigation is that the epistle to the Romans was made rather than written. There is evidence also that it was once extant in a shorter form. This may be inferred with probability from the omissions of Irenaeus and Tertullian inciting it, but in any case it is clear that the Gnostics, whom they opposed, and who preceded them considerably in time, used a shorter epistle. According to Hippolytus, in Philosophumena, Book 7, chapter 25, who makes no remark here on the textual difference, Basilides quoted the substance of chapter 8 verses 19 through 22 in a briefer and more intelligible form than that of the canonical text. the creation itself also groaneth and travaileth together, waiting for the manifestation of the sons of God. The inference that he had a different text before him is confirmed by comparison of chapter 5 verses 13 through 14 with another citation which Hippolytus makes further on. To Moses from Adam then sin reigned, as it is written. This is not a quotation from the canonical text, but recalls it, and is explicable on the supposition that Basilides used a form of the epistle no longer extant. We have more information about the text read by Marcion. This was certainly shorter than the canonical text, which Tertullian accuses him of mutilating. We cannot, of course, take the word of the Catholics for it that their text was the original, though there is no need to accuse them of bad faith. The mere fact that the copies they had before them contained passages not included in the epistle recognized by the heretic was sufficient in their own eyes to justify the charge of falsification current from Irenaeus onward. In reality, there are positive grounds for holding the form of the epistle read by Marcion to be the older. Irenaeus wrote his chief work against the heretics at least 40 years after Marcion came forward at Rome, and this allows time for modifications to be made in the text, and for unjust suspicions to arise about the reason of the differences. For Marcion, Paul was the apostle. He did not take him over as an authority from his opponents. Irenaeus and Tertullian, on the other hand, were busily engaged in trying to capture the apostle of the heretics in the Catholic interest. Which, then, is more probable, that Marcion set up for himself an authority to which he could appeal only after extensive mutilations? Or that authority, which, as we must remember, he himself and the men of his direction had brought into repute, afterwards received additions and underwent modifications from the other side? We need not regard him as exempt from the bad habits of the 2nd century in regard to texts that were to be quoted as authoritative. But if he attempted a falsification on so large a scale, it seems strange that he did not carry it through more efficiently. In the text he used, passage after passage stood which his opponents could afterwards allege against him, while others were absent which did not even to the smallest extent tell against any position of his. And if, while he was about it, he had done the work thoroughly, he would not have found it necessary to write a controversial treatise to prove that Paul, in spite of some appearances to the contrary, was really on his side. On all grounds, we must conclude that Marcion's shorter text was earlier and more original than the canonical text. C. General view. Putting the various considerations together, we may state the result thus. The Epistle to the Romans was constructed with the aid of short treatises already extant. These were at various times taken up into a composition in the form of a letter, which went through several editions. Each time they were modified and adapted in view of the relation to the whole. The earliest edition was much shorter than the final one. Conjectures may be formed as to the outlines of the epistle at earlier stages, but there can be no thought of actually reconstructing the editions or determining their no doubt very complex relations to one another. End of Part 2, Chapters 1 through 3.